Welcome to Techies for Reproductive Justice, the podcast, a place for technologists and community organizers to learn from each other. In this podcast, we'll explore security tips and operations security for organizers, how to help keep our movement safe online, the intersections and history of technology, reproductive justice, and other types of movement work, what organizing in the digital age looks like, and the pros and cons of technology and organizing. I'm your co-host, Azamare.
And I'm your co-host, Lou. Morgan is an entrepreneurial engineer and advocate focused on equity and access with a decade-plus experience in civic, financial, and digital health technologies. Morgan spearheaded product initiatives and supports reproductive justice through equitable solutions. Their expertise lies in user-centered software tailored for marginalized populations. Morgan built scalable solutions at Apple, Rally Health, Wells Fargo, Moody's Analytics, and VotingWorks, an open-source auditing tool used to audit over 5 million ballots during the 2020 presidential election. Morgan's record of collaborative innovation, engaging stakeholders, showcases their ability to advocate for privacy and accessibility in healthcare. As CEO, Morgan leads organizational strategy and product vision at Share Equity.
Before we get into our interview, it's time for T4RJ's media recommendations of the week, your spot for all things reproductive justice, social justice, and tech media recommendations. This episode, we want to highlight the podcast Death Panel. Their tagline is Politics, Culture, and Public Policy from the Left. Medicare for all now. Solidarity forever. Stay alive another week. Hosted by Beatrice Adler-Bolton, Artie Vierkant, Phil Rocco, and Jules Gill-Peterson, this podcast focuses on the role of the state in keeping us alive, or more often, hastening our deaths. If you find our conversation with Morgan interesting, we know you'll love Death Panel. Now let's get into the episode.
Thanks so much for joining us, Morgan. Really appreciate you taking the time, even as you're far away.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, our first question to kick us off, I'd love to hear about what your path was into technology, digital security, reproductive justice, and the intersection of all of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a software engineer for about 10 years before I found my way specifically to digital security and reproductive justice. After college, I taught myself to code through sort of the usual suspects like W3 schools back in the day. And for several years, I worked for like a variety of different companies. My first job was I worked for my friend's startup doing basically like digital hospice care work and like palliative care work to connect like families and communities around like death and dying. And then I like slowly started working in like in other areas for other organizations. I worked for big companies. I've worked for Apple. I've worked for Rally Health. I've worked for a variety of organizations. My first digital security role actually was at Apple. I was on their InfoSec team and doing work around like providing like secure websites to provision VPNs. And then I was hired as a founding web developer for a organization called VotingWorks. And that was really exciting. My role there wasn't explicitly security. I was a UI engineer, but we built voting machines and risk limiting audits. So security was always like top of mind. We talked a lot about the intersection of essentially transparency and digital security, because the VotingWorks is and was unique because the code for the voting machines and the risk limiting audit is completely available on GitHub. So that's actually how we tested its efficacy, by making it completely public. So in 2019, I joined VotingWorks as the founding UI engineer for a tool called Arlo, which was like the first widely available risk limiting audit that had ever been built in the United States. And then it was used to audit the federal, like the national 2020 election in states like Pennsylvania and Georgia. We worked with the secretaries of state. So for example, the Georgia Secretary of State was our direct client, and we were involved in like the full ballot tally kind of recount of the votes in the state of Florida, which were directly contributing to the confirmation of the election of then President Biden. So VotingWorks was really exciting. for a variety of reasons. And one of the reasons was that I got to learn a lot about like civic tech and basically the change management and deployment of civic tech at like the state level, because the purchasers for our tools were also typically counties, because those are the entities that like manage elections at the local level. And our company was really small. There was about 5 or 6 of us when I was there. It's grown, I think, since then. So got to learn a lot about like the interactions that organizations have when working with entities around change management, when those entities are focused on like public works, like in this case voting, but later public health became interesting to me. So 2020 was a very exciting year because I was working for Voting Works and I was also doing the initial research for the NGO that became known as ReproCare and is now known as Share Equity. And I was also a hotline volunteer for Access Reproductive Justice, which is California's abortion fund. I was there for about 2.5 years, from 2019 to 2020, like roughly 2021. So it was a very exciting time, full of a lot of change and knowledge acquisition. So what brought me to kind of from just the path of like technology into digital security and reproductive justice was wanting to use my technology skills in a more civic minded way. After having been in the industry for about a decade, I started wondering how engineers use design thinking to solve social problems. And I started Googling and learned about digital and internet-based organizations that did direct service delivery around abortion access. First, the organizations involved more in self-managed abortion. So I learned about Women on Web and Women Help Women and Women on Waves. Then there were founders who were very generous with me. So I got to talk with some really excellent people like Susan Yano and Rebecca Gompertz, and they just gave me their time and told me a lot about how they did service delivery. And the result of that work was that my co-founder, Phoebe Abramowitz, and I founded ReproCare Healthline, which was one of the first safe abortion hotlines in the United States that provided medical information and accompaniment support for people having or planning an abortion in the United States to ensure that folks could access care. And then in 2020, another project grew, which is the project that now lives under the banner of Share Equity. And that is the Salesforce SaaS-based, basically like financial remuneration app known as Autonomy. And that came about because I was a hotline volunteer. And so I saw a lot of how much effort it took for people to actually to raise the money to get an abortion and for that money to actually be delivered to providers, and the amount of like paperwork and spreadsheets and kind of back and forth and calls involved. And that was all before Dobbs when I was at Access. So even then it could take like up to 12 interactions for someone to actually be able to get like from the realization that they want an abortion into the door of a clinic. And now post Dobbs, and with so many closures and so much complexity and so much travel, it's more touch points. It's more organizations to interact with. It's a higher likelihood of travel. It's a higher likelihood of not being able to get an appointment, a way to have a more expensive abortion. So in 2020, kind of looking ahead and in anticipation of the possibility of losing full access, which was even then like looming, right? Like we saw Dobbs coming. I started to wonder what, again, like the digital health like space essentially could, within the repro world, could do to shorten that process for folks. Because there are sort of 3 key touch points where people can get like lost, essentially. One is referrals, scheduling, and the actual financial component. If you don't know, you can't go. If you don't know, you can't get an abortion. If you can't get an appointment, you can't get an abortion. And if you can't afford it, you can't get an abortion. Or if you can't get time off work, for example, in terms of scheduling, you can't get an abortion. So wanting to address these friction points became really important and top of mind for me. And so that work is reflected in Autonomy. So that's how I got into reproductive justice work, through a lot of like just kind of volunteering and trying and talking to folks and seeing what was needed, and then learning about frameworks and practices as I went.
Thanks so much. Yeah, we talk so much in T for RJ about the tech that we're using being, built in solidarity and not for charity. And a big way to do that is by like having people who actually have the experience of like being a hotline volunteer, or people who've gotten abortions, like being the people who are at the front lines of building the tech. And for you to have that, hotline experience and the technical skill is so great. It's such a great way to start. So thanks for sharing.
Of course.
Yeah. How do you see the state of reproductive justice and abortion access today?
I think that's a complicated question with a lot of different answers. From my perspective, so the reproductive justice framework is folks should have a right to have a child, to not have a child, and to have a child in a like safe and optimal like lived experience, right? Including like not being hungry, not being exposed to violence, not being exposed to the adverse impacts of climate change. And so it's a really intersectional and comprehensive framework. And I think the reason it is because it's centered on the bodies of AFAB and FEM folks, like non-binary and trans folks of reproductive capacity, who are people of color. And so that harkens a lot of different lenses, like by default. It harkens like anti-colonial lenses, it harkens like health equity lenses. And so from my perspective, with the focus I have is primarily on change. It's on change management, system change, and like healthcare, like digital healthcare systems. And so reproductive justice from that perspective, I think about what a really good healthcare system looks like, sort of broadly, but also what are the social conditions and social determinants that would need to be in place to create and sustain that in a real way. So, for example, I currently live in France, and I looked a little bit at the French healthcare system, and it's not perfect, right? But there are just certain like human rights-based assumptions about the social services that French, like people who are in France, are entitled to. And a lot of those concepts are really like dear to like sort of the French national identity. And so folks have these basic assumptions that, people are going to get certain things related to their health because of the basic fact of human dignity. And like no such assumptions exist in the United States, particularly around abortion, access, and reproductive justice. There are places within movement work, for example, accompaniment models, where there are really sort of fundamentally different paradigms at play, even than having the concept of a nationalized healthcare system or the concept of Medicare for all or like affordable insurance, like some of the paradigms we use in the United States, which, while some of them, if we did them, may be better, are also still really based on like a really racist system that created health insurance because we couldn't conceptualize the health, like the care of minority individuals, like particularly like Black racialized individuals, being something that was like a matter of public concern. So we had to create insurance and like differentiate like one type of health from like another human's type of health. Accompaniment, I think, is very interesting because it conceptualizes wraparound care like as a basic, like obvious consideration, and that automatically factors in social determinants like where someone lives and affordability and co-occurring healthcare conditions and interpersonal relationships and community solidarity. And those types of considerations, when like enacted with seriousness, like can function to basically like proxy a healthcare system, right? They can, that type of community-based care can replace entire swaths of what in the United States we spend a lot of time like trying to figure out how to pay for. So that's really interesting to me. So I think reproductive justice, at least from a service delivery lens, for me takes into consideration if we were to create the world that we want to see, and if we were to really think about what paradigms of human interaction could be in place to foster the growth of actual like healthcare, what would that look like? And the answer to me is that it would serve everyone across a variety of vectors. So that's what I think reproductive justice is a long answer. And I think the state of it in the United States is that it's changing. I think that because of the state of our public healthcare system in general, which is that we basically don't have one, and the state of abortion access in the United States, which is, of course, that it's been decimated. And we're looking at losing more ground over the next few years. I think we're being pushed to a place where we have to be creative and we have to look at other models. So I think the really creative work that's being done both in the United States and in cross-cultural, cross-national settings is probably the most innovative work that's happening in healthcare in general right now, and will serve us well in the future. But we have to invest in it with our intention and stick it out. So that's what I think the state of reproductive justice is today in the United States.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I really appreciate the angle you took that. I think a lot of time in this podcast, things do tend to be like US centric because we're from the US, or most of us live in the US. And hearing about how other cultures and other countries kind of view healthcare versus how we do here in the US, especially when you were talking about just like basic things that just come with healthcare in France and other countries as well, how they're seen as like just a basic human right versus here, how that influences healthcare here and there. Really appreciate that lens, I guess.
Yeah, totally. It's very interesting. Like that's why I enjoy and moved to France. It's kind of hard to conceptualize sanity when you're living in a system of insanity, where just none of the basic assumptions make sense. You know?
Yeah, like we've all gotten so used to things we've just gotten used to things not being automatically granted to us, I guess. Like it's just normal to think that you have to pay for, like, healthcare is separate from dental care, is separate from eye care. Like those things are just like maybe not necessarily normal to us. There's like,
yeah, we're like
a lot of people
traumatized.
people have accepted it. Basically, they're just like, yeah, that's just how things are.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and they all serve to like separate us from each other, and this like accompaniment, like holistic model that you're describing, and like the ways that if we had more access to like a neighborhood doctor, or like, you know, a midwife is next door, just like even like to having that closeness and not all of these like points of insurance red tape to go through, how much better that would be for us as individuals and our health, but also for like community health and like sustainability in that way.
Yeah. And it's totally straightforward too. Like that is like, I super agree with you, Lou. And that's a big idea. Like, and also in France, there's a service called SOS Médecin, and you can call them and a doctor will come to your house for like, for like not that much money for like any medical reason. I had the flu and a doctor came to my house because like it was a really terrible flu. And I was like, wow, never. That would never happen in like
yeah. Yeah, you mean I don't have to pay $100 for a 10-minute telehealth appointment for them to prescribe me Tylenol? I can't imagine.
Unfathomable.
This is actually making me think about our response, like the US's response to COVID, and just how things have played out and like why things have played out the way they have. It's kind of wild just thinking about, I mean, the way I think people see it now is like very individualistic. Like, oh, if you get it, it's fine. Like, it's just a flu. It's whatever. And people aren't necessarily thinking about, a lot of people aren't thinking about like how it affects communities. That kind of just like made me really think about how it's just like not surprising that that's how we handled it here so badly. Not saying every other country was like so much better, but I do think that the way that we view healthcare here definitely influenced how it is currently playing out too, because I don't even feel like COVID is really necessarily seen as a pandemic anymore. I mean, like, it's still a pandemic.
Yeah, the book, have you read the book Doppelganger by Naomi Klein?
No, I'm going to write that down though.
It is a very good book. It's it's about a lot of different things. She also talks about like Palestine and Israel and like the sort of the dichotomy or the dialectic between like the world people want to see and or the worlds that we invisibilize. But she also talked a lot about how like sort of the digital age and the weird like mirror echo chamber of like the media world created sort of the perfect storm where people like really started to buy into these like sort of like really like eugenicist fascist like notions of like what health and wellness was, mostly for financial reasons, because a lot of the wellness influencers who are, you know, like influencers are basically small business owners because they have like they're their brand and they have to promote themselves and then they get a following. And so there's a lot like there's this like wellness ethos that's really connected to like individualism and capitalism in the current economy and the economy basically of the past like I guess like 10 years. And so she talked about how she interviewed like this woman who she thought was like who would be progressive, right? Like seemed like she was progressive, like had like previously voted for the Progressive Party. This was in Canada. And that person said, like Naomi Klein asked about how she like thought the pandemic should be handled, especially for people with adverse co-occurring health conditions, and that the woman was like, those people should die, basically. Like just had this totally insane eugenics-based answer whereby like individualism and like health and like like health expression had been completely fused. So I think you're right. Like we have not only do we not have a public health system in the United States, we don't have a concept of public health. Like we don't have this like notion that like when I do something, it impacts someone else. Like we now have basically rights and liberty are the right like not to have to do something, like the right not to wear a mask. It's not like freedom from tyranny. It's like anything I guess in the way of my individualist like self interest, which is like also really minimized by like the late capitalist economy. So it's like really it's like a really an illusion. But like the few little things we have to try to differentiate how we can be sovereign are things like, well, I don't have to wear a mask and like I'm fit and can run on a treadmill and like I'm going to judge my neighbor because they can't. So it's actually it's like actually crazy. It's like it's like actual insanity. And yeah, we just we sort of like fundamentally need to rethink a lot of things, I think, to kind of come back from the edge where we've got to with respect to like how we totally disregard like the concept of interconnectedness as it impacts like bodies in general.
Yeah, that is a big task, but one that I believe that we can do, or at least I'm telling myself that we can do.
In pieces, right?
In pieces. Well, you talked a little bit about it earlier, but I'd love to hear more about your new project in share equity and why you decided to start a new thing and how it evolved from ReproCare and yeah, just how it's been to start a new project in this moment.
Yeah, totally. So that answer is actually pretty short. So we actually rebranded ReproCare to be Share Equity, and then we had two projects and we split them into two organizations. So the Healthline retains its name. So the Healthline is the ReproCare Healthline, and that project lives under the banner of ReproCare and is run by Phoebe Abramowitz and Lupita Sanchez. And then Autonomy, which is the SaaS-based financial support platform, lives under the name Share Equity. And we split them apart this year because of essentially risk mitigation, because they had sufficiently different threat models where they needed to be like legally separated. And that's why.
Yeah, I love hearing about your projects, and I don't know, I just love hearing the work that people are doing. So we kind of have talked about this a little bit, but what do you think the reproductive justice movement needs more of right now?
I think we need more money. And I think we need more money because we don't have enough money. like 50% of abortions are paid for out of pocket. 70% of people who are seekers are low income. Most organizations struggle with sustainability and livable, sustainable experiences for frontline staff. Clinics are being impacted by instability and closures. Almost no abortion providers' budgets are based on the cost of care, as in their balance sheets don't balance based on what a patient can pay, because abortions cost more than most people can pay who need them. So everyone is subsidized by individual donations or philanthropy. And there's a high concentration within the philanthropic space of essentially like just a few donors taking care of like a large, like disproportionately large amount of direct service and like other care, movement building, policy advocacy change. There's a few people doing all the work, right? There's a few people holding up like the public healthcare system with respect to reproductive healthcare access in the entire country. And so there needs to be more money, and that money needs to be diversified across like interests and industries and concerns in order to have a seed change and a change of consciousness in terms of like, do people actually expect to get like free, low cost or affordable, accessible reproductive health care? There needs to be a larger conversation and a larger interest within. I think part of it comes from philanthropy, actually, whereby more people are just willing to pay for reproductive health care for other people. And I think it's even valuable to diversify the investment vehicles involved in raising and storing the money, because that's the only way we're going to get it. Abortion care has been removed from, and now policy around Medicaid has been changed so that even where Medicaid was paying for other types of reproductive health care services, not abortion care, but like contraception and pap smears and things like that, now there's not a guarantee that providers are going to be able to access it in every state. But with that like major policy and financial change, it's doubly important that there's a like really concerted effort for folks to step in and figure out how to continue to subsidize the care. So there's a major change happening within the financial landscape of reproductive health care access right now, and it's impacting how we can continue to deliver care. So I think my very simple answer is that we just need more money to sustain this change over time.
Yeah. And do you think there's a world in which that doesn't come from philanthropy, or doesn't depend on like these few donors giving more, or other donors coming in?
I think so, but I think we would need other healthcare models to sustain it. Like we would need broader donations, but we may also need, like subscription-based models or people to just donate. Instead of paying for their own care, they like donate into a pool, and the pool goes to basically pay for multiple people. So we would need to, I think, get creative around making it not only like a donation, even a grassroots donation where folks are like giving generously because they have a community orientation, but like at some level having folks like when they pay for their care, they're like automatically paying for the care of other people. And that's sort of assumed. And that like living in the infrastructure of like major service delivery channels for how people access reproductive health care. So if I pay, if I can afford to pay and I pay for a condom, like I'm cool paying for two, right? And then the second one goes to someone else. And that's it. So I think because we're still dealing in a system that is dealing in like money and the ask in this case is more money. I think that we need a like financial culture change within like reproductive healthcare like services that just sort of make this assumption an underlying part of the bulwark that there's not enough money. So we need to diversify the burden and make it like quote unquote the burden, right? But like the financial responsibility and make it everyone's responsibility by default.
I'd love to hear how, I guess, the reproductive justice frame system in France and how things are handled in France, because I am realizing that in the US, I think we are kind of used to just, oh, a nonprofit will do it, or some org will hopefully help. I mean, it's kind of, I guess, just like fucked up that we have to, instead of being able to rely on our governments, we have to rely on philanthropy or mutual aid groups, and not just in reproductive justice work, but like across the board. Like, for example, whenever all the stuff happened in Asheville with like the hurricanes and flooding, a lot of the groups that were helping were literally just like local mutual aid groups that don't have any like power or like tons of funding. So yeah, just wondering how things are done in France, and maybe just if you know about Europe in general, because those are different. They do have different healthcare systems.
Yeah, well, I just know a little bit about France, and I mean, my experience is that basically you get a carte vitale, and the healthcare services are largely paid for by taxes. So when you have a carte vitale, every doctor will accept it, and then there is a copayment sometimes, but the copayment is like 10 euros or something, and that's for like substantial healthcare appointments. Once you have a card, you're in the system, and you can be seen by like more or less any provider. You know, I think you can opt to go to, like, for example, the American hospital, and then you can pay bills to have healthcare. But most people will just use like the normal system, and there's also apps like Dr. Lieb, and then you can go on and make an appointment, and like most providers are on it, and you can kind of get, you know, any provider to see you for a variety of concerns. So just our like really fragmented insurance system doesn't exist, and the really high co-payments and surprise bills don't exist. Abortion access is available by default up to 14 weeks, and then after that, folks do need an approval. But you know, once you get the approval, you can access care. So, all in all, it's a much more affordable system. You know, no system is perfect, but it's much more affordable overall. And like, I think there's even data that shows that basically it's ultimately more expensive to have a system like ours, which like has fragmented, like to basically and underinsure people, and to have this like system of insurance. It's like ultimately more expensive than to make sure everyone has like some coverage. So we're kind of like paying to keep people in poverty and like in systems of lack of access. And again, I think that's basically because of racism and like ideology. It's just like we're afraid of the concept of socialism. And France isn't even like a socialist country. It's a democratic socialist country with like, you know, some healthcare, you know, with some social services, and but people fight austerity measures. But because of basically, I think because of slavery, and racism and segregation, the concept of like being responsible for someone else is like so foreign to us that we would rather die. Basically, we'd rather die, and we'd rather have other people die than just have everyone like live together, which is bad.
Yeah.
And crazy.
No, literally. It's wild. I feel like that's everything after COVID. That's just something I'm like reconciling. I'm like, wow, people really don't care about other people, or they don't care about disabled people, or they don't care about old people. Like the whole thing with like, oh, I'm fine as long as I'm not immunocompromised or old. It's just like, that's just a wild thing to say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the system is built for us to not care about each other, and like makes it easier if we don't care about each other, right?
Totally.
Bleak. Well, hard left turn for our final question. Amidst all of this bleak, extractive, late capitalist terrorscape, what sustains you outside of work when you're not head down on the computer or flying across the world for all the important work you do? Do you have any hobbies or other activities that keep you going?
Yes, my hobby right now is eating. I'm kidding a little bit.
That's incredible.
Yeah. I've learned to sort of appreciate like time, like intentional time with friends. I think that's also something that America sort of acculturates us out of or would like to, right? Like most Americans don't take their PTO. We work like more than 40 hours a week and we like eat our meals at our desk. And I'm learning that there are plenty of places in the world where people work hard, but they also spend a lot of time with friends and family, and they go to lunch and they take their weekends and they listen to how their friends are, and then they let that sustain them, and that energy creates a reason to like want the world to be better. I think I'm finding that you have to find, aside from like wanting justice, it's also important to find things like in life that you just like love and enjoy, and like people that you just love and enjoy. And so I've been really fortunate to be able to like build relationships with people I've met, and that's definitely what sustains me. And then the food here is really good, so I usually go out to eat.
Yeah, that I would imagine it would be endlessly entertaining in France. But I also think, like, we were talking about how you cultivate or how you unlearn this, very US idea that we're only in it for ourselves and not for other people. Like, spending time with friends is also doing that important work of like reprogramming ourselves to like care about each other more, and not just about like what can this other person give me, but what can we build together and how can we sustain each other through like a sense of mutuality.
Yeah. Yeah. The human interaction part is really important. And I think there's also a component of like, I think some of also like the fear of losing individualism is also a fear of like it's like a fear of giving something up, or a fear of losing something that would like otherwise sustain us, and not trusting the systems or the idea of the systems that could exist if we were to actually like feel like we were all in it together. So I think with kind of being intentional and trying to slow down, like not to accomplish less, but to just like be more in harmony with like nature, people, places, things, with just the world, without being like, accelerationist about trying to fix all of our problems. There's like, there's a harmony in that. And then from that place, it's easier to think about like, how do we collectively co-build solutions that we agree on, and like wanting to have agreement and like wanting to have harmony. And from the desire, like the actual desire to have agreement and harmony, like we avoid harming each other more naturally because we care about each other. And that like sense of just innate human reciprocity is sort of the seed for, well, then how do we actually build better systems and like support community structures that like center this harmony? And then we sort of naturally move away from this hyper individualism and the systems that like profit from it. It's a long task, but I think it's important to do it at an individual level first. So that's my answer.
Thanks so much. Yeah, really appreciate you sharing so much of your journey and your vision and how we can get there.
Yay. Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
Podcast. This episode was brought to you by Techies for Reproductive Justice, a project of the Digital Defense Fund. Your hosts for today's episode were Lou and Azamare. Thanks to our frighteningly fabulous editor, and thank you to Morgan for sharing their story with us today. If you liked what you heard, stay in touch with us by subscribing. Want to become a member of T4RJ or have ideas for future episodes? Check out our website, techies4rj.org, to learn more and send us a message. Again, that's techies4rj.org. Our theme music is Beauty Flow by Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com. The song is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license. And thank you to all of our listeners. We're grateful to be in this movement together. See you on the internet.